So now let's take as brief a look as we can at triggers. A trigger is a coded database event. What do I mean by that? I mean it's a chunk of code that will be executed when an event occurs in the database. You have to specify the event, but that event will cause the execution to occur. The trigger will be executed when X happens. It can be used for things like referential integrity, which is dangerous. It's not recommended. It can be used to log events in a database, such as when you add something to one table, well, you say, well, something was added to this table, and you put a log entry into another table. Auditing is internalized in Oracle and is much more efficient for doing something like that. Look into auditing if you're thinking of using event triggers for logging. Here is the trigger syntax for the create trigger command. Again, not really similar to create procedure and create function syntax because there's a lot of other things in here, but still you create or replace the trigger. You can alter the trigger and compile it, only you cannot change the code with the alter command, which would make perfect sense to not do that. So what do we do here? When you have a trigger, you say before something happens, after something has happened, or instead of something. What this means is that you execute the trigger before the trigger in DML event, such as an insert statement. Before the insert statement is actually executed, go and do something else and process it and come back. Then execute the insert. In this case, you would execute the trigger and the code inside the trigger after something like an insert statement has already been completed. Or you can say, as opposed to doing this insert command in certain situations, I want to instead of go and execute the trigger content instead of that command. And obviously before, after, and instead of applies to different types of DML commands. So before insert, before update, before delete, or you can even have before insert or update or delete, and also update on specific columns. So it can get quite complicated. And you can also reference the changes in data. Whilst the trigger is executing, you can look at the old value in a column and the new value before you change it for purposes of comparison. Obviously, how would you tell that something is changed with an update statement if you can't access the two values? You may want to set the new value based on what the old value is. That's why it's there. And you can also execute for each row in the processing of the trigger. So now we're back in the Oracle manuals again. So master book list. Important point to note. For PLSQL, if we go and look at the SQL language reference guide, create function, create procedure, commands like that are actually still vaguely accessible. Well, let's look at create trigger specifically, since we're working with triggers at the moment. They're in the SQL language reference guide. There isn't much to them in here, right? SQL language reference. Let's go back up to here. If you go and look in the new features, if you scroll down, you will find a whole section in the SQL language reference guide that says this stuff has moved to the PL language or PLSQL language reference guide. So go down to here. So just remember that. When you're looking for the create procedure, the create function, the create trigger, any of those PLSQL commands, they're in this manual. They're in the PL language reference guide, not the SQL language reference guide. So let's go and look at create trigger. There is a whole lot of stuff in here that we could go through. There's a whole lot of detail that we don't want to go through because we don't want to write an entire course on PLSQL. We simply want to introduce it here in a single chapter. As you can see here, we've got before, after, instead of, the basics. I want to look at for each row. I want to find, for the purposes of an exercise, the explanation for each row. It means that everything happens for each row that gets passed through the trigger. This topic will be continued in the next movie.